Corey considered himself a professional in the art of partying, both on and off the clock. When he wasn't at work, you could find him in his garage surrounded by dirt bikes, tools, and a couple of his closest buddies. They'd sit on mismatched lawn chairs, cracking jokes, sipping cold beers, and listening to classic rock. It was the kind of laid-back life Corey loved. But when 9 p.m. rolled around, Corey swapped his oil-stained t-shirts for his driver's uniform, a Hawaiian shirt, jeans, and a pair of aviators, and hit the road. He wasn't just a party bus driver, he was the party bus driver. His bus wasn't some old clunker with bad upholstery. It was a neon-lit nightclub on wheels. With strobe lights pulsing to the beat of whatever song was blaring through the speakers, coolers full of ice for BYOB drinks, and even a tiny bathroom in the back, Corey's bus had a reputation for being the best ride in town. The first group of the night was typical, a bachelorette party of 9 women who piled onto the bus with squeals and matching bride squad sashes. Corey greeted them with his usual humor. "Ladies, welcome aboard the SS Party Express. I'll be your captain tonight, and yes, there are life jackets in case things get too wild." The bride-to-be, already tipsy and wearing a veil with flashing LED lights, burst into laughter. "You're hilarious. Can we keep him?" They spent the next 3 hours hopping between bars, belting out off-key karaoke, and taking selfies in the neon glow of the bus. Corey had to admit, these groups were his favorite. Loud, a little chaotic, but ultimately harmless. The second group was a mix of frat guys and sorority girls, celebrating someone's 21st birthday. They stumbled onto the bus, each holding a drink and shouting over the music. "Dude, this bus is lit!" one of the guys exclaimed, slapping Corey on the shoulder like they'd been best friends for years. Corey smirked. "Glad you think so. Just don't spill your drinks, or the cleanup fee is coming out of your beer money." They laughed and broke into an impromptu dance-off in the aisle. Corey cranked up the music, his head bobbing to the beat as he maneuvered the bus through the city streets. The night continued with the usual chaos. Drinks were spilled, someone tried to climb onto a speaker. That's not a stripper pole, bud. And the bathroom line became a source of endless drama. Corey navigated it all with his trademark humor, cracking jokes to diffuse tense moments and making sure everyone had a good time. By the time the second group piled off the bus, Corey was feeling pretty good. He leaned back in the driver's seat, taking a swig from his water bottle and scrolling through his playlist for the next group. But as the clock inched closer to midnight, something began to shift. The usual rowdy groups were replaced by quieter streets, and Corey noticed a slight chill in the air. It wasn't unusual for business to slow down around this time, but tonight the silence felt heavier. Corey brushed it off. Maybe it was just a slower night. He glanced at his schedule. One more group to pick up. A private party. Nothing unusual about that. But when the group finally arrived, Corey's gut told him something was off. Corey sat in the driver's seat checking his phone while the bus idled in a dimly lit parking lot. It was 5 minutes past midnight, and his next group was late. He didn't mind. It gave him a moment to stretch and reflect on the night so far. The bachelorette party had tipped well, and the frat crowd had been rowdy but manageable. All in all, it had been a solid night. Corey whistled along to the song playing softly through the bus speakers, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. That's when he noticed them, a group of 5 figures emerging from the shadows. Corey frowned. They didn't look like the usual party crowd. No neon dresses, no goofy hats, no one staggering under the influence. They were all dressed in dark, formal clothing, as if they'd just come from a funeral. "Great," Corey muttered to himself. "Goth night on the party bus." As the group approached, Corey couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was something unnerving about the way they moved, graceful, almost gliding. The leader, a tall man with piercing gray eyes, stepped onto the bus first. He handed Corey a folded piece of paper without saying a word. Corey opened it, his brow furrowing as he read, "If we all pass out at the same time, do not interfere. If you hear screaming, do not turn around. When dropping us off for our stops, stay on the bus, or you will regret it. The red liquid you see is not blood." Corey laughed nervously, waiting for the punchline, but the man's expression didn't change. Is this some kind of joke?" Corey asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just follow the rules and everything will be fine. Corey glanced at the rest of the group as they filed onto the bus. Each one looked as pale and elegant as the first, their faces expressionless. One woman carried a sleek black bag that Corey swore was moving slightly, as if something inside were alive. The uneasiness in his gut grew stronger, but Corey reminded himself he'd seen his fair share of weirdos in this job. Maybe they were just eccentric rich people with a flair for the dramatic. "All right, folks," he said, forcing a grin. "Welcome aboard the SS Party Express. I hope you brought your dancing shoes." None of them laughed. The leader merely nodded and took a seat at the back of the bus, the others following silently. Corey shook his head, muttering under his breath as he put the bus in gear. Tough crowd. The first hour of the ride was uneventful, but unsettling. The passengers didn't request music, didn't talk, didn't drink. They just sat there, staring out the windows, or at nothing at all. Corey tried to break the tension with his usual humor. "You know, most people who get on this bus are halfway through a bottle of tequila by now. You guys are making me feel like I should have worn a suit." No response. He sighed and turned his attention back to the road. The strange group had given him a list of stops, all in odd, secluded locations. An abandoned warehouse, a desolate park, a crumbling old mansion on the outskirts of town. At each stop, one or two of them would exit the bus, disappearing into the shadows without explanation. Corey stayed on the bus as the rules demanded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening out there. It wasn't until the third stop that things took a turn for the terrifying. Corey was scrolling through his phone trying to distract himself when he heard a muffled scream from outside. His first instinct was to look, but the rule echoed in his mind. If you hear screaming, do not turn around. Corey gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. The screams grew louder, more desperate, and then silence. When the passengers returned to the bus, their faces were smeared with red. The woman with the bag licked her lips, catching a stray drop of the crimson liquid. Corey's heart pounded in his chest. The leader met his gaze in the rearview mirror. "Remember the rules, Corey," he said softly. Corey nodded, swallowing hard. Whatever was happening, he didn't want to know. As the bus rolled through the dark streets, Corey's mind raced. These weren't just weird rich people. Something was seriously wrong. And for the first time in his life, Corey was terrified. Corey drove in silence, the faint hum of the engine the only sound on the bus. His usual jokes were stuck in his throat, and the chill in the air seemed to seep into his bones. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The passengers sat quietly, their faces pale and still, except for the occasional glint of red on their lips. The stops continued, each more unsettling than the last. At a derelict warehouse, Corey saw shadowy figures moving in the darkness outside. At an abandoned park, the passengers returned with their clothes torn and dirt-streaked, but none of them seemed to care. Finally, the bus came to a stop outside what looked like an old church. Its windows were boarded up, and the steeple leaned at an unnatural angle. "Wait here," the leader said as the group filed off the bus. Corey nodded, his heart racing. He was starting to put the pieces together, though he didn't want to believe it. The pale skin, the eerie silence, the red smears on their faces. These people weren't just odd. They were something else entirely. The door closed with a hiss, and Corey sat frozen in the driver's seat. Minutes passed, then an hour. He tapped his fingers nervously on the wheel, his thoughts racing. What am I doing here? Why didn't I just say no? His train of thought was interrupted by a loud thud against the side of the bus. Corey jumped, his heart pounding as he looked toward the source of the sound. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came the scraping, a slow, deliberate sound like nails dragging across the metal exterior. Corey's grip on the wheel tightened. "Don't turn around," he muttered to himself, remembering the second rule. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, a low growl, deep and guttural, that sent shivers down Corey's spine. The growl grew louder, joined by more of the same, surrounding the bus. Corey's imagination ran wild. He pictured feral beasts, their glowing eyes watching him from the shadows, their claws poised to tear through the thin walls of the bus. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Corey let out a shaky breath, his eyes darting to the clock on the dashboard. The group had been gone for nearly 2 hours. He considered breaking the third rule, stepping off the bus to see what was going on. But the thought of those things outside stopped him. Finally, the passengers returned. They stepped onto the bus one by one, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The leader's eyes met Corey's in the rearview mirror. "Drive," he said. Corey put the bus in gear and pulled away from the church. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and his mind raced with questions. It wasn't until they reached the next stop that Corey's worst fears were confirmed. The passengers exited the bus as usual, disappearing into the night. But this time, Corey couldn't resist the urge to peek. He leaned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse through the side mirror. What he saw made his blood run cold. The group had surrounded a man, a lone, unsuspecting pedestrian who had likely been walking home from work. Corey watched in horror as they descended upon him, their movements swift and animalistic. The man didn't even have time to scream. Corey looked away, his stomach churning. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, and tried to block out the sounds of tearing flesh and muffled cries. When the passengers returned to the bus, they were eerily calm as if nothing had happened. The woman with the black bag sat down near the front, flashing Corey a blood-stained smile. "You're doing well," she said softly. "Not everyone makes it this far." Corey forced a smile, though his insides were screaming. He wanted to quit, to pull over and run, but he knew there was no escape. Not tonight. The final stop came just before dawn. The group exited the bus for the last time, disappearing into the shadows without a word. Corey sat in stunned silence, staring at the bloodied floor of the bus and the faint handprint on the window. When the leader returned alone, he handed Corey an envelope. "For your trouble," he said, his voice as cold as ice. Corey opened it after the man left. Inside was a thick wad of cash and a note that read, "We'll be in touch." Corey sat there for a long time, the envelope clutched in his hands. He wasn't sure if he'd just survived the night or if he'd narrowly avoided becoming their next victim. One thing was certain. This wasn't the end. Corey didn't sleep that day. Every time he closed his eyes, the images replayed in his mind. The pale faces, the screams, the blood. By the time night rolled around, he was a wreck, but he couldn't afford to miss work. When he walked into the dispatch office, his manager Jerry greeted him with a grin. "Corey, how's the party master doing?" Corey forced a weak smile. Fine. You got tonight's schedule for me?" Jerry handed him a clipboard. "Same as always. Easy money, right?" Corey hesitated. He wanted to tell Jerry everything, about the group from last night, the rules, the horrifying stops. But who would believe him? Instead, he glanced at the clipboard. "I'm gonna need to put a group on the no-ride list," Corey said, his voice low. Jerry raised an eyebrow. "Another one? Man, that list is getting long. What did they do?" Corey struggled for the right words. "Let's just say, they're not the kind of people you want on this bus." Jerry laughed. "All right, I'll add 'em. What's the name?" Corey realized he didn't even know their names. He scribbled the Midnight Group on the clipboard and handed it back. Jerry chuckled. "Midnight Group, huh? Sounds like some goth kids. You sure they didn't just spook you with their emo vibes?" Corey didn't answer. The night started off like any other. His first group was a bachelorette party, wild and carefree, just like the last one. Corey tried to focus on them, joking around and cranking up the music, but every so often his mind would drift back to the previous night. When his second group boarded, a rowdy bunch of college kids, Corey felt a pang of relief. Normal people, doing normal things. He even managed to laugh a little when one of the guys tried to start a conga line on the bus. But then, around midnight, he felt it, that same chill from the night before. It was subtle at first, like a draft sneaking in through the bus's vents. Corey glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the pale faces of the Midnight Group staring back at him. They weren't there. "You're just paranoid," he told himself, gripping the wheel tighter. As the night wore on, the feeling grew stronger. When Corey dropped off his last group, the streets felt unnaturally quiet. He decided to take the long way back to the depot, hoping the familiar route would calm his nerves. That's when he noticed the black car following him. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but no matter where he turned, the car stayed behind him, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. Corey's heart raced. He picked up speed, weaving through the empty streets, but the car kept pace. Finally, he turned onto a secluded side road and slammed on the brakes. The black car pulled up behind him and stopped. Corey waited, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The seconds stretched into minutes, and then the driver's door opened. It was the leader of the Midnight Group. Corey's breath caught in his throat as the man walked toward the bus. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a lion approaching a cornered gazelle. When he reached the door, he tapped on the glass with one pale finger. "Open up, Corey," the man said, his voice muffled but calm. Corey shook his head. "No way." The man's smile was cold. "You've been doing so well. Don't ruin it now." Corey's hand hovered over the controls. He could feel the man's eyes on him, sharp and unrelenting. Finally, the man stepped back. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone almost amused. "But remember this, you can't run from us. You can't hide. We'll always find you." With that, he turned and walked back to the car. Corey watched in the mirror as the vehicle disappeared into the night. When he finally made it back to the depot, Jerry was waiting for him. "Rough night?" Jerry asked, noticing Corey's pale face. "You could say that," Corey muttered, handing over the keys. Jerry frowned. "Hey, you know you can talk to me, right? Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out." Corey hesitated. "Jerry, do you believe in vampires?" Jerry stared at him for a long moment before bursting into laughter. "Man, you've been watching too many movies. Get some sleep, will ya?" Corey didn't argue. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that his nights on the party bus were far from over. Corey didn't want to go back to work the next night. He'd spent the entire day in his garage, tinkering with his dirt bike and cracking open a few beers, hoping the normalcy would drown out the fear gnawing at his gut. But by the time 9 p.m. rolled around, he found himself back behind the wheel of the party bus. Bills didn't stop just because your job was terrifying. The first few hours passed without incident. A group of friends celebrating a promotion, a birthday crew decked out in glow sticks. It was business as usual. Corey even managed to crack a few jokes, though his laugh felt hollow. But then, during a lull in the night, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an email from Jerry. Subject, "No ride list updates." Body, "Corey, I added your Midnight Group to the list. Funny thing though, this list is getting way too long. At this rate, we're gonna run out of customers." Corey frowned and scrolled down. The no-ride list stretched for pages, filled with names and vague descriptions. The whispering couple, the shrieking woman, the shadow boys, and now, the Midnight Group. Corey's stomach churned. He'd thought the vampires were a fluke, a one-off nightmare, but clearly there was more to this job than Jerry let on. As he pondered the implications, the GPS on the dashboard pinged with a new address, an old industrial district on the edge of town. Corey's heart sank. He wasn't supposed to have another group tonight. "Maybe it's a mistake," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. When he arrived at the location, the scene was eerily familiar. The streets were dark and deserted, and a group of shadowy figures stood waiting in the glow of a single flickering streetlight. Corey's pulse quickened. These weren't the Midnight Group. They were different, but no less unsettling. A tall woman in a flowing black dress stepped onto the bus first, her smile revealing sharp, glinting teeth. She was followed by two men in tattered suits, their faces hollow and gaunt. The last passenger was a child, a little girl clutching a tattered stuffed rabbit. Her eyes, black as night, locked onto Corey's. "Drive," the woman commanded, her voice silky and cold. Corey hesitated, his mind screaming at him to get out. But the memory of the Midnight Group's leader, the promise that they could always find him, kept him frozen. He nodded and pulled the bus onto the road. The rules were different this time. "Turn off the music," the woman said. Corey obeyed. "Do not stop until we say so." He nodded, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. The passengers whispered to one another in a language Corey didn't understand. Their voices were soft but carried an unnatural weight, like the hum of power lines before a storm. As the night wore on, the tension on the bus grew unbearable. Corey felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with a suffocating energy. When the woman finally spoke again, her tone was sharp and commanding. "Pull over here." Corey did as he was told, stopping in front of a boarded-up theater. The group exited the bus, their whispers fading into the shadows. For a moment, Corey thought he was safe. But then the little girl stopped at the door and turned to face him. "Don't forget," she said, her voice unnervingly sweet. "We're watching you." With that, she disappeared into the night. Corey sat there for a long time, staring at the empty street. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The Midnight Group, the no-ride list, the strange passengers that seemed to be multiplying. None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. The world wasn't as safe as he'd always believed. When he finally returned to the depot, Jerry was waiting for him. "How'd it go?" Jerry asked, his usual grin replaced with a serious expression. Corey handed over the keys. "Jerry, what's going on with this job? The no-ride list, the weird passengers. What aren't you telling me?" Jerry sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, Corey, you're not the first driver to ask questions, and you won't be the last. The truth is, this city's got shadows, things you don't want to know about, and for some reason they like our bus." Corey stared at him, waiting for more, but Jerry just shrugged. "If you want out, I get it. But if you stay..." He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the clipboard with the ever-growing no-ride list. "Just follow the rules. That's all you can do." Corey didn't respond. He grabbed his jacket and walked out into the night, the weight of Jerry's words settling over him like a storm cloud. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the bus wasn't just a job anymore. It was a doorway into something dark and dangerous. And once you stepped through, there was no turning back.